I did want to finish on the Indigenous voice to Parliament, effectively the PM firing the starter's gun today. I wonder if you've thought about this. If it does pass, should the coalition work with Labor to enact the will of the Australian people and legislate for a voice?
If I can, by the way, Tom, beyond Chris Bowen and the Labor Party, any other authority who knows nuclear energy is not saying it's cost prohibitive. In fact, it's actually very effective as bringing down power bills. To answer your other question, though, I'm not going to be engaging in hypotheticals. At long last, the Prime Minister has announced the date for the referendum. I just wish he took the opportunity to also announce the detail for which the Australian people have been waiting about what this voice actually represents. That's what people are waiting for. Happy to engage on why it's important Australians know what they're voting for before they vote, rather than hypotheticals, with all respect.
But this hypothetical is around what you'll do if the referendum wins, i.e. to what extent you'll respect the will of the Australian people. Sure, you can call that a hypothetical, but so is, will you respect the victory of Labor if they win a federal election, to which, you'd expect you to say yes rather than a hypothetical. So isn't this a bit different to other ones? I'm asking, will you go by the will of the Australian people?
Well, it is a little bit different, Tom, because today is the day that the Prime Minister has announced when the referendum will take place. And I think what should be on the front of the mind of every Australian is how they're going to vote at that referendum. Will they take the risk in a permanent change that divides Australia by race or not? Yes or no? That is really where I think the discussion has to be, rather than looking at different permutations, what might happen after that vote is cast.
Yeah, but it's not a whole lot of permutations, it's yes or no.
The Australian people are given the detail beforehand.
Sure, but if it's yes, if they take this risk that you're speaking about, if it's yes, would the coalition work with Labor on legislating a voice?
We've got one thing on our mind right now as a coalition, and that is to engage with the Australian people on the decision they all have to make. This is in the hands of the Australian people.
So you're reserving a judgment on whether you do that?
I'm not engaging in hypotheticals, and I apologise because I know you're trying to push me into it, but I'm not going to be going there on hypotheticals right now.
But you would, if I'm talking before a federal election, after the next federal election, you'll respect the Australian people's views and say, yes, Labor have been fairly elected, we believe in the result, they've won government. So what's the difference between that and saying, yes, we'll listen to the referendum vote and we'll work with Labor on passing something?
Well, Tom, why don't we make this agreement? The day that the Prime Minister calls the next federal election, why don't we do an interview and we have that chat then? At least I'll give you a firm view on the voice, because it would have taken place. I'm just not going to engage in hypotheticals, if that's okay, Tom. I respect you for pushing me there, and you're very good at it. However, I'm just not engaging in hypotheticals. Right now, Australians have the biggest constitutional question ahead of them. That's the key issue here. I truly believe the average Australian saying, oh, what's the coalition going to do afterwards, depending on this or that? That's not the key here. What's in the national interest is where the country comes down on enshrining a permanent change to the Constitution that the Prime Minister has failed to define. That's what's important. That's my focus, and hopefully it'll be the focus of the Australian people in the lead up to the 14th of October.
Okay, and in terms of that no case, do you feel concerned at all that there's a lot of negativity involved? Would we hear conversations later on perhaps about your plans to help close the gap, which ultimately both sides want to do?
I missed that last part. Ultimately what? Sorry, Tom?
Ultimately both sides want to. They want to close the gap between First Nations people and non-First Nations.
Oh, look, I think you make a really good point there. I don't think it's just both sides of Parliament, Tom. I truly believe that every Australian wants the best for every other Australian, but in particular for vulnerable Australians, including many of our First Peoples, especially those in remote communities. There's just no doubt about that. I think what's before us, though, is the question of how best that be done. So I don't think there's any sort of divide in terms of intent, But when it comes to the question of how it be done, I believe Labor has chosen a pathway it's failed to define, and that is inherently divisive. And that's the problem. Right. And I just think it's unfair, Tom. I think it's really unfair to be asking Australians to cast a vote on something, but then say to them at the same time, we're not going to tell you how it works until after you vote. I just don't think that's fair, and I don't think Australians would think it's fair.
Ted O'Brien, thanks for your time today.
Thanks very much, Tom.